Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the Fashion Declares expert webinar on governance, transparency and accountability. This is the 7th expert webinar to the 5 goals of Fashion Declares. So we're delighted to have experts from the field of accountability and transparency. Their expertise is much broader in terms of sustainability in the fashion industry, but they'll be talking specifically through the lens of accountability and transparency today. So we're delighted to have Maeve from Fashion Revolution from the Transparency Index, Shamik from Trust Trace, Abby from Compare Ethics, Gordon, who bless him has stayed up for us at 2 a.m. in Australia from Good On You, and Tom Berry from Farfetch. So Fashion Declares is a bottom-up movement. We started at the beginning of this year to give everybody in the fashion industry a voice, not just CEOs. And this is a platform to share best practice. So we've started with how-to videos to deliver on those 5 goals. So looking at how we can truly galvanize a strong voice for action within the fashion industry. So you might already have signed as a signatory, and these 5 goals might be already very familiar to you. But what we've been doing is we've been putting together webinars, tools, and a fashion industry action pack to help you, whether it's learning about decarbonisation, whether it's learning about living wages and how you address human rights within the supply chain, or how you just speak up for urgent action within your organisation. So fantastic resources there. Please do have a look. So the webinars you'll find on YouTube, and as I said, they cover everything from the circular economy to low impact materials, how you can build a marketing and comms strategy around the 1.5 or 2 degree lifestyle as we look to be heading that way or higher, and how to promote social justice. So the action pack is there on the Fashion Declares website. Please do download it. Please share it with your friends. This is a huge free resource that we hope that you'll find incredibly useful. So I just want to give a bit of a context. So many of us fashion leaders, we came together in 2021 to launch Fashion Declares at the early stage of this year. Because I think many of us were feeling really frightened and frustrated that there just wasn't the rapid and the urgent action and the voice that we needed. What you're looking at now is a slide of how in the last 200 years, how global warming has impacted our climate and the ecosystem and weather patterns. So if we look at the COPs, we'll be in Egypt for COP27 next month in November. Despite the various climate conferences, we still have this increase of temperature. We are heading towards 2.8 degrees above industrialized levels. We are heading for catastrophe. And what we need to do is we need to address it with the kind of urgency of action and commitment. And we feel we can do this best by sharing best practice and really calling for the kinds of legislative change that can drive that action. Many of you will already be aware of the planetary boundaries. There are 9 planetary boundaries, of which we have already surpassed 6 of the key planetary boundaries. And some of you may not be familiar. This is a relatively new diagram. Novel entities basically means the things that we as humans have brought into the natural environment, things like microplastics, nuclear waste, etc., etc. The area that's noted here as biosphere integrity means the loss of biodiversity. And you'll see at the bottom there, biogeochemical flows, which is the things that relate to the kind of agricultural practice in many respects. So looking at the nitrogen flows, phosphorus flows, which of course are very much down to the kinds of conventional practice that we have for growing cotton and of course the foods that we consume. So we are at a dangerous place. We really need to act like it is an emergency. We know that 89% of greenhouse gas emissions are generated from fossil fuels. So how we switch to renewables through every part of our supply chain becomes a really urgent question. And of course, we recognise that more than 2/3 of materials used in the fashion industry are actually from fossil fuels, fossil fuel derivative synthetics and materials. So many are calling on a cut in production of new product by as much as 75 to 95%, without which we won't be able to redesign the fashion industry to fit within those planetary boundaries that I just showed you. So the question for us all within the fashion industry is, how do we redesign the fashion industry so as to respect the planetary boundaries, but also to deliver the essentials, the needs of our world population at 7.7 billion. So redesigning, many of you have seen donut economics. This is a really great tool. You can also use it in your organizations when you're plotting and looking at your measurements, your climate action plan, and prioritizing different areas of your operations and activity through the supply chain and through your distribution and head offices. I think one of the galling things, and the thing that's becoming closer and closer in focus, is the impact of the climate crisis and how it's so unfairly distributed that the global south, that's responsible for only 8% of greenhouse gas emissions, is actually bearing the brunt of more than 88% of the climate collapse. And we're seeing that with the extreme weather events that we've all experienced globally, whether they be in Europe or the US and in Pakistan, and of course in Africa. So we're seeing more frequent weather patterns and the disruption that is bringing in terms of crop loss, also the devastation from floods and from cyclones. I know that Cuba is totally in a blackout at the moment, and then this extreme loss of habitable and suitable land and water, and the impact on food and water security, which will result in as many as 3 billion people being on the move by 2070, according to the Human Niche Climate Report. I'd really like to welcome a great friend of mine who I've worked with in Pakistan, Muneeb Nawaz. I felt sick to my core when I was reading more than a month ago about the floods in Pakistan, that more than 1.7 million homes have been destroyed or badly damaged, and that more than a third of the land in Pakistan is under floods, with more than 3.6 million acres of crops having been affected, and 1.8 million livestock that have been lost. I mean, this is a catastrophe of biblical proportion. I wanted to ask you, what's happening now in Pakistan, and how are you, as a business, as a fashion business, how are you changing your production, your supply chain in the face of the climate collapse?
Hi, Safi. Thank you so much. Firstly, honored to be here with you all. And as you said, the 88%, roughly speaking, of what is happening because of everything else in the global economy is hitting the global south. And this is what has happened to Pakistan in the last couple of weeks has been, like you said, biblical catastrophe. 1.4 million, 1.5 million lives of the animals have been lost. The food scarcity is already something that we are worried upon. And I think as a fashion brand, as a fashion business owner, it is now more of a responsibility on each and every one of us, including myself, that we want to figure out how to make sure that we can start doing the things that are possible and applicable, and more importantly, to understand the basic economics. Because I was going through the things that you were showing in the last 200 years. The last 40 years, what we've been taught in terms of economics is the land, labor, capital, organization as the factors of production. We've all spoken about what needs to go into the into the capitals, into the organization, into the labor as far as their requisites are concerned. But I think it is also very, very paramount that we consider that the land requires our efforts, because without that, we don't have a home. So whatever the economy has to be eventually has to take into account planet Earth, because that's how we're building our economies. And I think it's very, very important for me that my personal target is to become zero carbon neutral, hopefully by the end of 2024.
As a brand, and how will you do that? Because you have a lot of leather products. I mean, how are you changing your supply chains?
So, so one of the things that we've been working on is basically the supply chain in terms of the organic yarns, organic fabrics. We're moving a big load of our production onto handmade manufacturing. And I was talking to you about this earlier as well, that this is one of my personal goals. And I think in order to decrease the fashion production, like you said, by 75 to 95%, I think it's very important that we stop relying on more products and start going into what fashion is supposed to do: create better products rather than just creating more products. I think it's now the value of quality over quantity for the human life, as you said. So we're replacing leather with vegan leathers. We're replacing a lot of production on in terms of stitching, even on handmade production, and we're taking a lot of fabrics that are going to be hand woven now.
Amazing. It's so good to hear. Thank you so much for joining us, Muneeb. Thank you. I'd love to invite Maeve from Fashion Revolution, from the Transparency Index. I mean, you've got an amazing tool there, and I know that you've really built it up from scratch. But what would be really helpful is if we could understand how it's evolving. And what are some of the obstacles? What are your aspirations around the Transparency Index? Over to you, Maeve.
Yeah, happy to. And thanks, team, for having me. So yeah, Safi, I'm working for Fashion Revolution, and one of our big flagship activities is the Fashion Transparency Index. So I think maybe the first thing to say is we've been providing this index since 2016. So sitting in 2022, what it does really well is it acts as an interesting retrospective of where the industry is in terms of transparency. At the moment, we analyze 250 of the world's biggest brands, not in terms of how sustainable they are, but how transparent they are about environmental and human impacts. And we go really comprehensive, and we dig in a little bit more every year to try and keep the brands that we're analyzing essentially sharp, and to continue raising the bar on transparency. So just to kind of articulate our theory of change, what we're hoping is that by brands increasing their transparency, that obviously opens up more scrutiny and therefore more accountability and therefore change. But transparency can't be conflated with sustainability. It is really just a first step on the way to greater sustainability, and actually it's not radical in itself. But it can be really, really meaningful, especially when it's used and put in the hands of many people and many stakeholders. And what we see with the Fashion Transparency Index is it is quite well read. We get about 400 downloads every week, and we get really interesting stakeholders paying attention to it, everyone from investors in the fashion industry to trade unions to academia. So it is certainly becoming more mainstream in terms of folks trying to find out what is the state of the industry in terms of transparency. And just a really tiny piece on methodology, we do try and compare apples to apples. So we are looking at 250 of the world's biggest brands that are over $400 million turnover. And we do look at a spread of production across different geographies, and we cover both public and private, and many of them would be household brand names that all of us know very, very well. So I think just to give a few highlights from this particular year, just overall progress just is too slow still. 24% is the average across the brands that we review. And we have seen progress, but we probably see it in the more conservative areas. We still see a huge cohort of brands scoring less than 5%, which just shows that while there's a few different tiers of brands, there's brands that are slowly changing, but we still have a stubborn chunk of the industry that is quite resistant to movement on transparency. And this would probably be an area that we see that conservatism. So, many of us who've been in the industry a while, 10 years ago, the conversations around brands disclosing first-tier suppliers were tough, and it seemed like quite a radical idea. Whereas now, this is an area that we've seen progress. 48% of major brands are disclosing their first-tier suppliers, but we still have half who are disclosing nothing. So that first-tier supplier list, that's been hard fought, and campaigners, activists, trade unions have pushed for this for years, but we still don't have this fully in the mainstream at the level that would suggest that we're moving in the right direction at scale. And yeah, I mean, Safia's presentation really puts it in perspective, but we don't necessarily see the movement on climate transparency at the level that we would wish. So, we have decarbonization targets being published by brands, but it's still a minority covering the entire supply chain. So that stubborn world of scope 3 emissions is one that we really need to get to, and being transparent on what that looks like has to be a first step. So it's something we're really encouraging in our brand conversations. This is a huge one connected to the climate emergency. We still see that 85% of major brands are not disclosing annual production volumes. So there's different figures bandied about how much the industry is actually producing every year. And we know, we see, images, we see waste, we see everything that shows that this is alarming. But we don't have those drill down volume figures from brands at scale. And this is a figure that we're not really seeing move year upon year. So of course, that reduction in production Safia talked about, it doesn't look like that's being addressed at a serious level from the mainstream brands that we look at. And of course, greenwashing is very, very topical at the moment, and we do see some transparency around claims, but then we see some distinctions too. So 45% of brands have a target on sustainable materials, but then just 37% of them are saying what constitutes a sustainable material. So that world of the wild west of language and kind of different terminology, we're not seeing progress there at the rate that we would really like. And this is just one that I really want to emphasize. We still are seeing that 96% of brands do not publish the numbers of workers in their supply chain paid a living wage. So, over the years, we've seen commitments made on living wages, and living wages get an awful lot of airtime, but that movement that would show that there's impact on the ground and being able to disclose how many workers are accessing living wages, we're not seeing it when it comes to transparency. So for us, this really shows that there's still resistance around this issue. And this is a figure that hasn't changed for us over several years as well. So one of the things that we've done with several coalition partners is we've launched a new campaign. It's called Good Clothes, Fair Pay. And what it's activated around is compelling the European Commission to introduce an EU law on living wage due diligence in the fashion sector supply chain. We're doing this via the mechanism of a European Citizens Initiative, which is a means by which, if the European Commission sees that there's 1 million EU citizens behind a legal proposal, then they will formally consider legislating on an issue. So we've been active for a couple of months. We'd love if anyone is keen to get involved, please do. And please, if you are an EU passport holder, do take a look at that website and do sign on. Our rationale is just that the voluntary movement from companies on living wages is just not happening. But post-pandemic, where we really saw a humanitarian crisis connected to workers being low paid, and the poverty wage issue just not moving, So we're really interested in the EU as a mechanism. But thank you very much, everybody, and I'm happy to engage further later on.
Maeve, if you wouldn't mind, please just popping the living wage link in the chat box. That would be really, really helpful. I forgot to ask you very briefly, what does governance mean to you? In a nutshell?
Regulation.
Regulation. Okay. Fabulous. Thank you so much. That was really clear. You set a fantastic context for the hour. I'd like to introduce Shamik Ghosh from Trust Trace. Shamik, I know that you set up the business a while back. You've been doing some really interesting things, and we know that just from September we've had this new EU regulation which proposes to ban forced labor of all products that are manufactured with forced labor then sold in the EU. So this kind of legislation and others presumably would be something that the Trust Trace platform would help fashion brands to really understand their risks and map out for opportunity. Firstly, just very briefly, what does governance mean to you in a nutshell? And if you could run through what Trust Trace does. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Safia. I'm happy to be here. I think it's a very nice group that you have got here. I think governance, I think generally is a part of the general environmental, social, and governance aspect from my perspective. I think generally it means self-governance. People should be conscious of how they are producing and how they should be responsible for their actions in the supply chain. But in the absence of that, of course, as Maeve mentioned, regulations are the key driver. And I think more and more is coming in, as you have rightly mentioned, the EU textile policy, plus also we see a lot of similar regulations coming in North America also now. I represent Trust Trace. We are a digital platform for product traceability and supply chain transparency. But it is very important for us to understand that while the words traceability, transparency, sustainability have been used a lot, I think as hinted by Maeve earlier, traceability is a tool. Traceability is not an end. I think people are using traceability to achieve transparency and sustainability, and that is what we have been helping the brands to do it. Our intention is to help the fashion industry. You can be a sustainable role model or a sustainability challenger. We are there to help anybody who is interested in turning the page there. So we are a B2B SaaS platform targeting towards the fashion brands in their journey to become more sustainable. Maeve, I think, covered it quite well with hard facts, but I think what generally we are seeing a big trend is, so we started, Trust Trace was formed in late 2016, early 2017 is when we started building the platform there. And we came out of this journey because we were working with sustainability role models like Houdini, Philippa K, Iceberg. They are coming from Sweden. And their biggest challenge was that they wanted to collect a lot of data from the supply chain because they did not have a good visibility of the supply chain. And that is when we found out that many of these sustainability role models who were able to self-regulate themselves very well, they were trying to take a very, very positive view about how they can make an impact towards it. But we could see that many larger brands were not able to do it. And I think now we see that more and more regulations are coming in to push mid-sized, larger brand, and also a big cohort of small and medium-sized brands to take actions. And that's why I see we have a new emergence of these more and more regulations. To just give a perspective, there are 3 or 4 different categories in which these laws sit in. So you have got the due diligence and the traceability laws, to largely saying that you should know your supply chain, you should know what is going on in the factories, you should be responsible for the living wages, the conditions of the factories, etc. Then you have got such strong laws coming on sustainability reporting, and then significant crackdown on the greenwashing claims coming from the marketing and the product labeling laws, and more similar. And there are also custom duties coming in play because of in case a particular product has been found is using forced labor or anything, you also have got significant amount of penalties and your product can get stuck in ports there. So where we are coming in from is that we are helping fashion brands to achieve this traceability. And this just gives you a perspective of some of the companies who have started working with us. Again, as you will see that there are companies who are in different levels of maturity. Some of them are sustainability role models, very, very ahead. They have got good control on the supply chain, but they use our platform to collect information and continuously improve their ESG performance. Then you have got sustainability challenges, and also few of them are sustainability laggards, but with a strong intention to pivot towards more sustainability there. So what do we do? So the platform that we have built is a tool for the fashion brand to first discover their sub-suppliers at a product level. So we always put all the information with the product as a perspective in the context of the product. So if you have got a jacket, or where is the tier 1 supplier, where is the tier 2 supplier, where is the tier 3 supplier, we help them discover. Some of these suppliers may be goods, but many of them may not be. So how do you work with each of the factories to improve the performance of the suppliers, be it chemical treatment, water treatment, soil erosion, etc., are the various parameters that they can be measured on. In the platform, you can measure up till 600 plus parameters through the platform there. The third aspect that we are helping the fashion brands is, it is very critical when you're improving your sustainability performance, you use more and more sustainable materials, right? And for that, you need to be very, very sure that as the processes flow through, your material compliance is very, very strong. And that is what we promise, or that is what we help them to achieve through the certified material compliance module. So these three modules work in together to achieve responsible sourcing as well as material compliance for the fashion brand. This, I think, is super important. I think for all the people who are in the, we do understand the industry is trying to learn more and act faster. So we have created a playbook which can be easily downloaded, and it is a guide for traceability. And also please subscribe to our Knowledge Hub and our newsletter. We do update people with the different kind of regulations and what is the impact on their business and how they can use traceability to overcome that. And I will leave there.
Thank you so much. That's really, really helpful, Shamik. I'd like to move now to Abby, Abby of Compare Ethics. I'm really excited to hear your presentation, and over to you.
Thank you. And I think starting with the immediate question around governance, there was a really amazing focuses on regulation, and I couldn't agree more. That's going to be a really key driver. I think for me, good governance really is about a move from the concept of shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. And when we think about that, we need to include our planet. We need to include the people that work directly for us and across that value chain. And I think if we can spread our sort of lens, if you will, of what we define as governance, I think ultimately it will really provide us with a framework to better address substantially at scale some of these issues. And I think that's a really big thing for businesses to get their head around, and depending on where you are in the world, slightly political. So I think that's a really big question, and I really probably could have a whole separate session on that. But today I'll focus a bit more on the accountability and regulation side of things. And what I'll try to do today is not dive in too much on what everyone else has spoken about, but rather maybe focus on a little bit more of the here and now of what we're seeing that businesses can do today to get on the front foot. A lot of people here today will probably be well aware of the real shift in the last few months from regulators cracking down, whether that's H&M and Decathlon right across to ASOS and Boohoo, lawsuits in the US for H&M, and then operational challenges here in Europe to take down claims. Now, that pressure cooker, I think, is a symptom of being a bit more on aspirational focus on ESG rather than being more data-led. And I think where where we come at this is really hoping to understand where businesses are on that data journey around impact claims, if you will, whether that's a due diligence claim of protecting workers or environmental claims. And I think what's super interesting to me is the increasing eyes and ears of the financial markets also peaking up on this. Just in the last few weeks, there was a £45 million short on the Boohoo stock. That was for many reasons, but one of them that kept coming out in the press from a lot of the market press was around the role in which the anti-greenwashing regulations and the failure to substantiate claims and have a clear strategy on ESG has a role to play in the market cap and confidence of the market in that ESG strategy. So what I think is super interesting of what's happening now versus maybe previous years where we've all potentially been banging the drum for now is, follow the money. The market is listening, and as this regulatory shift emerges, I think one thing for all of us to take away today to think about, how is this affecting my company from a market perspective if you have that exposure, but more broadly from an investment point of view, even the private market investors are increasingly including ESG due diligence parameters as part of any investment thesis. And to not bore you too long on a Wednesday afternoon on finance, but it's just such an interesting driver of the intersection between that regulatory shift and the finance world is to also think about how powerful good data can be. It doesn't have to be a scare story. Like, how can we best leverage better data to get a better price for a loan from a bank? NatWest are coming out, there's multiple products surrounding things like that. And how can we better look at positioning ourselves as a leader in the market through having this better quality ESG data? So with the landscape moving fast, I think I won't go into the really great repetitions of really the types of regulations that are coming in, but maybe zero in on the type of data that's needed, because I get asked all the time, this is where we're at, what can I say on it? And I think really focusing on third-party verifiable data, really focusing on chain of custody certifications, linking those to purchase orders as a way of substantiating your claims is a really, really great baseline to start with. And I know that is so huge when you start thinking about it. But ultimately, that was a really awful screen grab, very pixelated there, that I took from a European Commission consultation. Ultimately, when we are thinking about impact being communicated, we need to think verified, we need to think third party. And like I say, I think with the regulations, whether that's due diligence, as we've talked about earlier, or whether that's a focus more on the environmental side, it ultimately can be your superpower, and creating these business cases to transform your business. This doesn't have to be a compliance tick box. It doesn't have to be scary. This can be such a powerful opportunity to transform business to that stakeholder governance structure that I talked about at the beginning. So a
2 minutes left.
2 minutes. Well, I'm glad to speak more about the market. A bit more on us. We're an AI platform that supports compliance at scale. So we've been developing a methodology that focuses on environment, social, and governance impact. So we look at data quality across your supply chain and tell you what you can say. So I'm going to skip to the last few slides. The core of what we do is in 3 steps. We identify your compliance gaps, and then we help you communicate those to consumers and investors. We have actually developed a community of over 200 leading enterprise businesses across the retail sector. So tomorrow we actually have an event with Mary Crane, a leading policy expert from the EU, who will be joining us to talk about these impact regulations in much more detail. So if you are in London and fancy an after-work drink to continue this conversation, do drop us a line. There should be about 60 high street and global online retailers there. I believe Nat's just put that in the chat. And then last couple of slides, I think we've got a couple more, and then we are all good. I'm almost ready to get the dong. I'm almost ready. But yeah, if you'd like to find out a bit more about these events, do just click on the link and sign up, and happy to share a bit more. We're always Chatham House rules and always focused on hearing some of the concerns that you are facing in implementing some of this, because we realise that it is always tricky to get that compliance right. So happy to catch up on that offline, but thank you.
Amazing work, Abby. Really looking forward to seeing you tomorrow in person. Yeah.
Right.
So I'd like to move over now to Gordon. Good on you. Thank you so much, Gordon, from joining us from the other side of the world. It's the most unearthly hour there. You're an absolute darling to stay up. Can you tell us, how are consumers powering the green transition through the Good On You app, and what are your plans for it? And if you could tell us a little bit about what you also feel contextually is driving what you're doing. And if you could first tell me what governance means to you.
2 points. Point one about governance, I would say that what others would call stakeholder capitalism, what I think Fashion declares, just saying that environment and social outcomes are part of your purpose, obviously is a sort of gold star for governance. The other related governance point that my head of ratings wanted me to make is that ultimately, at the end of the day, we care about outcomes. And whilst there's evidence that better governance will produce those outcomes, if you only have the good governance, then various rating systems, ESG rating systems, or Good On You or whatever, should not give you a good score until you're actually getting those outcomes. So I think the caution here is to overweight governance in comparative tools, not to overweight governance. Right, thanks. I want to talk about 3 things very quickly. One is emphasising the importance of consumer decisions in creating a more sustainable world. The second is to talk a little about how Good On You helps us do that, or helps consumers do that. And I want to touch a little bit on the kind of legislation that promotes transparency and accountability, and a couple of my concerns about the response to greenwashing, which I actually think could send us backwards rather as well as forwards. We'll get to that at the end if I have time. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, thanks. So often we hear voices in the sustainable fashion movement frustrated by the slow pace of change. And their response to that frustration is to call for legislation. And they're absolutely right to be frustrated by that pace of change. And they're right that we need better laws. But to the extent that those voices want to give up on empowering consumers as a driver of change, I think they're seriously misguided. 3 reasons. First of all, it's far from easy to get the right legislation enacted. And even if we could, legislation can't fix all of the problems in the world. Second, my background is a consumer advocate, and consumers demand agency. As consumers, we have a right to make choices that align with our values. And that's what drives the demand for transparency, because producers have a corresponding obligation to be transparent about all relevant parts of their production process. And one key role for legislation, and I think when we talk about legislation, we have to be really clear about what we want it to do. One key task of legislation is to support consumers by ensuring that transparency is delivered. The third reason then that we want to keep consumers engaged is because we need their support to get those laws passed. Good proposals don't become law just because we can explain how the benefits would flow from them. It's always a hard fight, as we've seen by things like the penny tax law not getting up, by the modern slavery law not covering everything it should. So every kind of support is valuable. But you might say, consumers say one thing and do another. How can we rely on consumers to help us create change? And indeed, surveys claiming that 60 or 70 or 80% of consumers prefer sustainable products or will pay more for them are published very frequently, several times a year. But that behaviour is seemingly not borne out in practice. The number of shoppers regularly choosing the lowest impact options is much lower than those surveys suggest. So a key explanation is that, of course, that it's easy to give a pollster the morally correct answer that, of course, you care about these things and you're going to act on it. But in real life, we all find reasons based on price or features or style or convenience that mean we make less sustainable choices. It's also worth remembering that nobody goes shopping to buy sustainability. We always have a very specific want or need that we're trying to meet. And, our purchases are really diverse, especially in fashion. There's rarely a side-by-side choice of a more and a less sustainable product that otherwise meet your needs. And so all of our purchases are quite complex trade-offs between the different things that are important to us. But the good news in the slide is that as many as 50% of consumers feel conflicted, research suggests, when they're not making sustainable choices. And so we've got something to work with. If we can overcome the barriers that are stopping people make sustainable choices, then we can create much more pressure on brands and reward the brands that are meeting consumers' needs, both functionally and with sustainability. So move quickly on to good on you. As the slide said, our vision is a world where everyone, everywhere can know the impact of a product on the issues that they care about equally as easily as they can know its price and features. Moreover, they should be able to find lower impact alternatives with a similar price and features instantly. And that finding is the key thing here. So here's what Good On You does. We've built a robust rating system for fashion brands that considers up to 1,000 data points in the 3 areas of people, planet and animals, and so far have rated about 4,000 fashion brands and published those ratings. We're aiming for many, many more in the next year or so. We make those brand ratings available to consumers directly through our app and website, and indirectly by working with partners, retailer partners, including Farfetch, and product discovery partners like Microsoft Bing, who use our data to identify the products and brands on their platform that meet minimum standards that we're looking for. We want to keep working in a collaborative way with all organisations in the space to maintain that credible, robust rating system and to help empower retailers to stock and market the options that are best for our world. And so to create business for the companies that are doing well and take business away from those who are not. Finally, to talk a little bit about legislation, I think it's really important when you're thinking about what kind of legislation we want to think about exactly what it's going to do and how it will work and how it will impact on the market, including on consumers. And so clearly we need, as I said before, legislation which encourages, incentivizes or requires transparency. And we need legislation which combats greenwashing, which we're getting a lot of attention from in Europe in particular, but in other jurisdictions. In Australia, the ACCC, the CMA equivalent, just announced another sweep of websites for greenwashing to take action. But I think something that's missing here about in empowering consumers is support for processes that provide consumers with robust comparative information. And there is support for quite precise support for certain kinds of eco-labels in the EU proposals, but I think it needs to go broader and look at other independent comparative information. Of course, regulation should prohibit the worst practices. So EU REACH rules out certain chemicals. California's just introduced laws against PFAS in clothing coming in soon. Legislation can incentivize better practice, and we can need enforcement by regulators. So they're the kinds of things that legislation can do. Some of the issues that I'm concerned about is that some of the anti-greenwashing legislation and information requirements, when it focuses just on products, you can get situations where a large brand will say, hey, we've got these great products, we're going to market them heavily, they comply with all the laws, we're truly giving you the right information, but they only make up 1% of our range. So we've got you into our store, we've got you into our site, and then you see the other stuff that you really like and you buy that instead. So you can actually kind of still get around it in that way. I'm worried that the laws prioritise single issue claims, like we've got recycled packaging, over a holistic approach that the products and the brand are actually addressing climate change across their operations, are addressing living wages and worker safety across their operations. I worry that the cost of eco labels, which will be prioritised, penalise smaller brands which can't afford them. I worry that we're prioritising environment over social, and I worry that we have rather too much confidence in LCA data and asking it to do more than it really can do. So all in all, the attention on using legislation to help us solve the problems that we have with sustainable fashion is fantastic, but I think that there's a fair bit more that needs to be done to make that legislation truly empower consumers and get the environmental outcomes and social outcomes that we actually want.
Thank you.
Where's
so
the bell?
much, Gordon. Thank you so much, Gordon. No, it's really, really helpful, and for the the importance, yes, of legislation, but that caveat that we should continue to empower consumers, and also questions around product or organizational. There's so many different issues there, I think. Tom, you've worked with Good On You, and I know that you've been educating and helping to empower the Farfetch community. Would you like to tell us a little bit about what governance means to you and to Farfetch?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Saf, and hi, everyone. Couldn't agree more with all of the other speakers today, and wish we could work more closely with all of them, really. But yeah, like in terms of the brief on governance to me, at an organizational level, means having the kind of systems and structures in place, and that means like people and people who have accountability and oversight, and having objectives, and having the reporting and kind of accountability assurance processes in place. So you've got those kind of systems set up so that you do what you say you're going to do, or so that you do what you're expected to do by stakeholders or even regulators. So that's broadly what governance means to me. And in the context of ESG, I just thought I'd talk through kind of how we approach, kind of broadly governance, but I'll give some really practical examples of how I think it plays out in terms of the things which I think we're doing to try and engage consumers and engage the businesses and brands that we work with. So this is an overview of our sustainability strategy, or our kind of mission to be the platform for good in the luxury industry. And it covers a number of different areas, as you can see, kind of 4 main pillars of work. We actually have a section of work on governance and engagement, and that's at the kind of very kind of top level, really, like kind of corporate level. And that's about having people in place. So we have an ESG board at the very top level of our company. We're a publicly listed company. Our board of directors is the kind of most kind of senior bit of that. There's an ESG board at that level. We have an exec committee which looks after and regularly meets throughout the year to kind of check on our progress against the goals and objectives that we set. So they're kind of accountable for it. We've also got a kind of cross-functional team. So it's not just the sustainability team who are interested in these areas, have a cross-functional team. And then we have a set of what we call in Farfetch objectives and key results. So each year we set them annually. They come top down. So our CEO has a set, and each person in the organization has them. And within those objectives and key results, there is at least one at the top level of company, and then more other parts of the company which relate to these goals that we have. So yeah, there's kind of the structures in place broadly at that kind of top level, which is what we include within governance engagement, including then our public reporting. So how we are doing against those goals that we've set. So for the last 2 years, we've done an ESG report, and SAS, so I think he's on the call, has led that. So yeah, we've got those kind of broad things which sit across all the pillars, but even within each pillar, we have elements of kind of good governance, I would say. And so just taking the positively conscious pillar of work, which is all about how we engage with customers and our brand and boutique partners to champion products which are better, enabling product choices which are better, that consider environment, social impact and animal welfare. And at that level, we've put a number of things in place. We've created a set of what we call conscious criteria. So we clearly state what we mean by a kind of more conscious product. That's publicly available, downloadable from our website. We declare when a product meets those criteria. We have a disclaimer, we call it kind of declaration on the product, why a particular product has met a particular criteria. And those criteria are all kind of independently based. We've actually worked really closely with Gordon and Good On You. They form the Good On You ratings form a key part of those criteria, but they've also reviewed the other kind of more product material based criteria for us, along with other kind of independent reviewers. All of the kind of material criteria are based on independent third-party certifications and recognitions within the industry. So it's kind of key that it's public. It's key that we're clear on why things kind of count consumers can see that it's key that we review them regularly. So we try and review them annually. It's key that those reviews are done with independent bodies like Good On You and others. We look at our goal in those, making it clear to consumers, is that more of our products each year that we sell, like, so more of the money that we make as a company is based on sales of those conscious products. And we report that both publicly, so we have a top level report in our ESG report, how we're progressing towards that goal, but we also report it internally to try and drive some of that accountability. So how is a particular bit of the Farfetch business, be that a brand partnership that we have, how's that brand partnership going in terms of the amount of conscious product which we're getting from that brand, or through that channel, or our boutique partners, or a bit of the business. You know, we own a retailer in London called Brown's Fashion. How much conscious product is Brown selling? We report those things internally, again, to try and drive accountability. So it's just one example, hopefully practical example, of how we are leveraging kind of good governance principles, I think, as an organization to try and drive change.
Thank you, Tom. Really, really helpful. I wonder if someone from Farfetch team could possibly put the reports you mentioned into the chat. We are coming up to 5 o'clock. I've mismanaged. I'm terribly sorry. I'm going to lead with one question. I'm going to ask for each of the speakers to make a 1 minute comment on it, which is going to be quite a tough one. So given that there are these disproportionate impacts on the global south, which is where the scope 3 supply chain tends to be for fashion, would it be useful to have a decolonial approach to climate action, or what would that look like? And the emotion behind the question is clearly, you know, how can we take serious and immediate action to mitigate the awful impact of climate collapse? To me, governance is the process, or the processes by which we deliver on our social and environmental responsibilities, and it's framed by all the stakeholders. So it's a continually evolving iterative process, but I do believe very strongly that we need legislation to push it forward and choke off the laggards. Sorry, that's a rather unpleasant way of saying it perhaps, but there we are. So to the question, how do we take a new approach in fashion to seriously reduce the impact on the global south? I wonder, Tom, could I come to you first?
Yeah, look, I'm happy to try and answer. You know, we don't buy that much stuff. We're a marketplace model, so our connection is through the kind of independent certifications. In that way, is kind of support for better social impact third-party assurance schemes. We arguably should be doing more kind of charitable work, but that sits for me in a kind of philanthropic bucket to support. But yeah, I think it's more through third parties that we could work.
Okay, great. Or welfare trade organizations, fair trade brands.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that, which should be a
totally. Yeah, that's
impact. And yeah, cool. Maeve, can I ask you the same question?
Sure, and I'm certainly not an expert on this, but I think for me, you know, thinking about fashion and the relationship with colonial structures, obviously what we're talking about power and power balance. And I think, you know, we haven't really got a chance to touch on it in this conversation, but purchasing practices, and also known as unfair trading practices, remain a real challenge in this industry. And we're operating in an environment where, you know, brands have huge leverage and suppliers are not in a position necessarily to negotiate back on it, except for in rare cases. And we really saw the most stark impacts of that, of course, in the pandemic when there was mass order cancellations. So I think while we're seeing greater visibility on purchasing practices, and it's talked about in forums like this, our data still shows that things like brands having a responsible purchasing practices policy is still a long way to go. More brands committing to things like not paying suppliers after 60 days is really slow as well, and that's something that suppliers have called for in droves. So I think transparency and also legislation to really look at those power structures and purchasing practices is a perfect place to start, and we need to get really serious about that. And I think any brand that is serious about decolonizing, the structure that we're in, that they have to look internally first, and they have to look at where are the areas that they themselves are driving negative impacts on human rights and the environment, and it definitely lies within their own purchasing practices. Thanks.
Couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely, and that is what that transparent system gives you. It allows you then to look at the critical path. It allows you to look at finance and longer term partnerships to generate social impact and innovation. Could I come to Shamik, and then to Abby, and then to Munib and Gordon?
I think for that first, I think, Safia, the brands need to know where the supply chain and what is the concentration of the supply chain where. I think most of the people, I think they only know, as I think Maeve also mentioned, very few of them are ready to share their tier 1 supplier, but I think they have to go beyond tier 1 to tier 2, tier 3 suppliers also, because that is where the impact is coming in from there. So
the power structure is already there, so that if unless there are laws in the global north of the high income countries to force this, we won't actually have the opportunity for the global south to emerge with decent human rights and for an environment intact. I mean, it's just nonsense of a situation, but here we are. Abby?
Yeah, no, I think I totally agree with, again, everything that everybody else has said. I think where I also maybe would add is that of a layer on top that we need is that, like, really leaning into incentive structures internally, because I think Tom and the Farfetch team are very far ahead compared to some of other brands and businesses in the market in how they're thinking about it, because they really see the value. I mean, everything that Tom just shared was a real clear. We're seeing the value, the market value of this, and I think really leaning into the incentive structures. I'm quite a cynic. I don't think we're going to get there otherwise, and I'm sure that even getting to a point of verified disclosure on ESG, whether that's social impact or environmental impact, and how I think we do that is by proving the value of having this data. So whether it is around case studies around market cap, access to capital in this market, when cost and access to capital pricing is so important, the quicker we can prove those incentive structures beyond a tick box, I think the more powerful and quicker we might be able to move on it. I appreciate that is, I say it very simply, so I appreciate how difficult that is across the whole industry, but I'm very passionate that if we can get these conversations right, it will really speed things up.
It will, and of course it unlocks amazing real stories and understanding of risk and opportunities for brand loyalty, employee loyalty, and investor loyalty, right? So, and hopefully cheaper finance. Over to you, Munib. From your perspective, how can we do things radically differently?
So I think, first of all, I think what we're doing is we're putting a lot of pressure from the brand's perspective and the people who are already running their businesses. I think we could also put the pressure on the producers to start disclosing their information. I think that could be one way of kind of dealing with the situation, because if the brands are unable to do that, there's a lot of because I work in Pakistan, I can see a lot of factories who are still very scared of telling anything to anyone, that because they have such big NDAs to kind of adhere to in order to be supplying to some of these bigger brands. So I think one of the regulations that could be passed on to, especially from the South's governance, should be that anybody who is a registered exporter should be allowed, or should definitely be ensuring that their information is shared with the public for regulation purposes. I think that could be one way of ensuring that the transparency comes from the supplier rather than from the customer. I think that could be one way of dealing with the situation. And then the local governments ensuring that their regulations and their goals and all of the transparency things that we're talking about are implemented, at least on the suppliers front, and then take things there from there on in.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting work on labor unions with the Asia floor wage, for example, to ensure that you don't have brands going to cheaper competing markets for labor, because often that's an issue that factories are disincentivized to delivering better in terms of both social and environmental. Gordon, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, brands have a lot of power, and they need to be incentivized to address the kinds of issues that Maeve was talking about, like their purchasing practice, but also living wages. And to do that, I think you need a twin strategy of appropriate legislation and supporting consumer power. I mean, at the moment, the debate's all about, let's make sure that when people do say something, they tell the truth, and that's fine. But actually, the more fundamental problem is that's just going to stop people saying anything. We've got to require them to be transparent about everything that is important for them to be accountable to the community, to consumers, to retailers, to investors, etc. So I think transparency legislation is really important. And then, moving on to address the particular drivers of disadvantage and power imbalances.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us for this last expert webinar of this year. And thank you so much to all the speakers today. Please, if you haven't already joined the Fashion Declares community, please sign up. Join us also on Patreon. Please follow us on Instagram, on Twitter and LinkedIn. We've had a blast with these webinars that have linked back to the 5 goals. These how-to videos and webinars are on YouTube, so please do have a look at them, and please download the Fashion Action Pact and share it with your peers and colleagues within your organisation. Thank you so very much, and thank you to the behind the scenes team, Millie and Richard.